Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. In this podcast, Tim Anaya, PRI Senior Director of Communications, and I chat with PRI President and CEO Sally Pipes on her new book, False Premise, False Promise, The Disastrous Reality of Medicare for All. In her book, Sally makes a case against Medicare for All using evidence from government-run systems in Canada and the UK. She explains how single-payer healthcare makes a litany of promises it can't ever keep. Thanks for listening. Welcome back to Next Round, Sally.
Thank you. Delight to be back. Healthcare, I believe, is the number one policy issue facing the country for the 2020 election, so much to talk about.
That's right. And you've got a new book out, False Premise, False Promise, which is your 8th book on healthcare. This one is focused on the problems of single payer. What was your goal when you wrote this book?
Well, the goal was that single payer Medicare for All has become such a prominent policy position among progressive Democrats. And I felt that while it's all hypothetical what Senator Sanders, Senator Warren, a lot of these people are saying about how single payer would mean there would be no private insurance, that everybody would get the very best of care and coverage. I thought it was important to use and give examples of single payer systems such as Canada, which completely outlaws, bans all private coverage for anything considered medically necessary, and the National Health Service, which covers about 90% of Brits. Tremendous problems with both of these systems, long waits, ration care, doctor shortage, and it's not free. So I thought I have to educate Americans on what a single payer system would really mean for Americans. And I think it's working, even the media, the op-eds, everything, because support in November was down for the second month for Medicare for All.
Sally, you like to say that healthcare is like an onion. It has many layers, and as I know, as someone who doesn't do well cutting onions in the kitchen, many tearful moments. Indeed, if you look at it, healthcare is very complicated, and that's thanks mostly to government's involvement in so many aspects of healthcare. But unfortunately, so many Americans are convinced that if government takes over healthcare, that costs would go down and everyone will have access to healthcare, and maybe we'll have kittens and rainbows and puppies for everybody too. How do you break through this mindset in your new book?
Well, I really point out how in a country like Canada, which has had a full takeover of their healthcare system under the Canada Health Act since 1984, I really point out what this has meant for Canadians. For example, the average wait this year in Canada from seeing a primary care doctor to getting treatment by a specialist, 20.9 weeks, the second longest wait time in history, and more than double the wait time back in 1993 when it was 9.3 weeks. Care is rationed. We can talk about how the elderly do not have access to care. There's a shortage of doctors. 1/3 of Canadians, about 1 million Canadians, are on a waiting list for some form of treatment. And, there are so many examples of Canadians who've been denied care. If you look at Michael Bublé, for example, when his son Noah in 2016 was diagnosed in Vancouver with liver cancer, he did not stick around in Vancouver. They immediately went to Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, where they had, as the crooner Bublé said, the very best of doctors, the very latest of care. And today, their son Noah is cancer-free. So many people in Canada don't have that kind of access and funding to do that. But it is important to know that 217,000 Canadians in 2017 left this country and went abroad, either to the U.S. or other countries, to get care where they felt the waiting time was just too long.
I think one of the best chapters in your book is the opening chapter, where you tackle a philosophical question: is healthcare a right? The left believes that it is, and it's tough to try to counter their argument when they have compassion on their side. Discuss why healthcare is not a right in the clear thinking way you do in your chapter.
Healthcare is a right is really the linchpin of the progressive Democrats, whether it's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the first-term member of the House from New York. She is the protege, of course, of Senator Bernie Sanders, who is really, I think in America, the Pied Piper of single-payer healthcare. And it almost seems like he will have another stroke, another heart attack when he talks about Medicare for All. He's so passionate about it. He is the one who says over and over again that healthcare is a right, it's not a privilege, and it should be available for all Americans. Everyone should have the very best of care, no referrals, no waiting times, no ration care, and of course it will be free. Healthcare is neither a right for the many or a privilege for the few. Healthcare is a good and a service. All goods and services have to be rationed, and healthcare is one of those goods and services. services. Declaring a right to health care that is green lighting essentially unlimited demand for health care will not miraculously engender unlimited supply to meet that demand. It's also unclear as to what a right to health care would actually mean. Does it mean the right to the very best of care, or does it mean a right to equal care? If it's a right to equal care, would the government have the right to ban people from paying for better care? And under Sanders' plan and Pramila Jayapal, the House member, Senator Warren's plan, if she became president within 3 years, she would implement single payer. It would mean that people would not have any access to paying for private or better care because all private care would be outlawed. Does the right to health care come with any corresponding duties? If I have a right to health care, does the government have the right to tell me that I have to keep myself healthy? Do I waive that right if I'm a smoker or if I'm overweight? These aren't hypotheticals. In the UK, under the National Healthcare System, which is 71 years old this year, patients are only eligible for certain procedures if they lose weight or they quit smoking. So how do we determine how large that right should be? Do we have a right to food? I mean, if we have a right to health care, it's more important that we have a right to food. We can't live without food. So I think we are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We want to open the market for health care so that everyone will have access to the most affordable, accessible, quality care. And going down the path to single-payer Medicare for all and saying health care is a right is going to be a disaster in terms of waits, ration care, lack of access to the latest doctors and treatments.
Sally, last fall, as some of our listeners may have seen, you participated in an Intelligence Squared debate in New York City on single payer. And you and Nick Gillespie of Reason, who was your debate partner, won that debate. And you managed to convince a tough, liberal New York City audience that single payer would be bad for the country. After the debate, some of the audience participants told you that your real-life stories of patients suffering under single payer helped your side of the debate win the night. Now, you've profiled many patients who are living under single payer throughout your book. Do you think that that will bolster your argument?
I think stories today are the most important way to reach the American people. The American people, their eyes glaze over when they hear that Senator Sanders' plan would increase federal spending by $30 to $40 trillion over 10 years. The total cost of health care would be $59 trillion over 10 years. People don't relate to numbers, but people do relate to stories. They do relate to the fact, as I mentioned about Michael Bublé, how he was able to and could afford to take his son to a children's hospital in Los Angeles. You know, so many of these stories are heart-wrenching, but they do reach the man on the street. My own mother, who passed away from colon cancer because as a senior, care was rationed and she couldn't get a colonoscopy. She finally did get a colonoscopy 6 months later when she was hemorrhaging. She did get a colonoscopy. She died 2 weeks later from metastasized colon cancer. I talked about in my book about Sharon Shemblaw, a mother of 3 from Ontario, Canada, who lost her battle with leukemia because Canadian hospitals lacked the resources to treat her. She could have survived with a stem cell transplant. By the time she got to the U.S., it was too late and she passed away. In Great Britain, Brett and Nagma King, they were thrown in jail in Spain for taking their 6-year-old son there to receive advanced cancer treatment that he could not get under the UK National Health Service. And of course, my favorite example is Rolling Stone frontman Mick Jagger, who at 70-something is still gyrating around on the stage. Earlier in 2019, he was diagnosed with having a heart valve problem. He did not go back to the UK, where he is from, and have it as valve replacement done there. He went to New York Presbyterian Hospital and had his heart valve replacement done immediately. And his brother, who's a couple of years younger in the UK, said, "At least Mick has not got to wait in line for the National Health Service." Mick Jagger, like Michael Bublé, they do have options. But for the average Canadian and the average Brit, this is not possible. So we have stories. We have to tell these stories. In Ontario, a doctor called in a referral recently to a local hospital to get an appointment with a neurologist. He was told there was a 4.5-year wait to see a neurologist. A 16-year-old boy in BC, where I'm from, waited 3 years for urgent surgery, during which time his condition deteriorated deteriorated so much that he became a paraplegic. In Montreal, a man who had needed urgent heart surgery found out because of a severe problem that he was eligible for the surgery, but he had died 3 weeks earlier. All of these are examples of the Canadian healthcare system, the British healthcare system, which deny care because government has to set a budget that it's going to spend on healthcare. We spend 18% of our GDP on healthcare in America. It is expensive. We're an expensive country. Americans demand the best. Canada spends 11% of GDP on healthcare, but that's why the demand is much greater than the supply. So you see long waits and ration care, and of course the fact that 217,000 Canadians go abroad when they think the waiting time is too long.
Let's turn for a moment on the presidential primaries, starting with Elizabeth Warren, who, because of her funny math on funding single payer, has fallen in the polls. Lately, she's pulled back on single payer, saying that a public option might be the way to go for the first few years, followed by a full-blown single payer system. She's even pared back further, saying that she'd like to give Americans the choice. So clear this up for us. In a public option, Americans can choose to keep their private insurance or opt out for a government Medicare-style plan. For a lot of Americans, this sounds reasonable. Talk about the problems of a public option.
Yeah, so a public option, which was in the original House version of Obamacare, would be a government insurance plan that would compete against private insurers. As Medicare for All has sort of declined in support, about 53% of Americans polled by Kaiser Family Foundation now support Medicare for All, down from a high of 59%. But the support for the public option or government plan is now up to 65%. So we've seen not Senator Bernie Sanders, but certainly Senator Elizabeth Warren, who was one of Bernie's soulmates on Medicare for All. She's moved away as she's declined in the polls from supporting single payer to supporting a public option. But a public option or government insurance plan is a stepping stone approach to single payer. Senator Warren would never say in the debates how much her plan would cost. Finally, she got Don Berwick, former acting chief administrator in the Obama administration under the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They came up with the numbers. Finally, they announced that her plan would increase federal spending by $20.5 billion over 10 years, which is significantly lower than Sanders's $34 trillion over 10 years. So even economists on the left have said her number is low because she doesn't account for the fact that if people think healthcare is free, they would demand a lot more of it. So because she was declining in the polls, there was a lot of backlash against single payer. She decided to come out and have a stepping stone approach. In early November, she said, I'm going to support the public option that anyone could buy into a plan that would offer free coverage to children and families making at or below 200% of the federal poverty level. That's an income of about $51,000 a year. Americans who want government coverage could buy into the plan at very low cost. So she said if she became president in the first 100 days, this would be her plan, would be to allow people to buy into a public option. By her third year in office, she would fight for a full transition to single-payer Medicare for all. So this is just a way for her to get around the declining support for Medicare for all by using a stepping stone approach. She totally still believes in Medicare for all, and there's no question that her plan would be even a lot more expensive and would probably come in at the numbers that I talked about, that Senator Sanders and the RAND Corporation Urban Institute, a liberal think tank, and the Mercatus Center have all come in 30 to 40 trillion over 10 years increase in federal spending with a total cost of about $59 trillion over 10 years. But this is just a ruse. She's trying to compete with Vice President Joe Biden, who's been a supporter of building on Obamacare and supporting the public option, and also South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg. He is also a supporter of the public option. He says his plan would cost $1.5 trillion over 10 years. But he did provide a point by saying that if the public option was not getting everybody insured, he definitely, too, would go to Medicare for all.
Sally, recently the House held hearings on single payer, and part of the discussion on how to achieve universal coverage focused on the trade-off between access to care and keeping costs down. Well, kind of ironic that at the same time, the Fraser Institute in Canada announced that the median wait time for medically necessary treatment in Canada this year was 20.9 weeks, and that's the second longest wait time ever recorded since 1993 when Fraser started measuring wait times across Canada. Back then, patients waited, it really was less than half the time at 9.3 weeks. Now, I think there's no better evidence than these these wait times to show that what happens when Canada attempts to keep costs down. So given all of this, why do so many progressives in the House think it'll be any different here in the U.S.?
Well, I think that progressives know that if we have a complete government takeover of our healthcare system, it will lead to long waits, ration care, lack of access to the latest treatments, doctor shortages, higher taxes, new taxes. All of these things are out there. When Bernie Sanders gets out there on the podium and says Canadian healthcare is free, he doesn't mention that the average Canadian family pays over $13,000 a year in hidden taxes to cover a system which results in these 20.9 on average waiting times from seeing a primary care doctor, getting treatment by a specialist, care being rationed, particularly by the elderly. He doesn't mention that Canada ranks 29th out of 33 high-income countries in terms of doctors per thousand population, that Canada has one half as many specialists as there are available in the U.S. on a per capita basis. He doesn't mention that 3% of the population, 1 million Canadians, are on a waiting list waiting for treatment. He doesn't mention that in Canada there are 35% fewer acute care beds available per capita, and that access to MRIs, 25% fewer in Canada than in the U.S. And actually Canada has fewer MRIs per capita than Turkey, Chile, and Latvia. So think about that. This is what this would mean for America. And there's no question all of these things would happen in the United States. I think the real issue here is that people like Senator Warren, Senator Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, their whole goal is for government to make decisions in our lives, and that we as Americans are not capable of making decisions. They have a view of America where government is in charge of everything. And so it's part of their long-term goal: free education, free healthcare, free medical training for medical students. All of these things are part of their grand strategy of making us a fully socialist country.
So, Sally, when weighing all sides of the debate, what do you think will be the ultimate outcome? Do you think that the Democrats will nominate one of the pro-single-payer candidates, or one of the so-called moderates who want to offer a public option or a more limited type Medicare plan?
Well, it's very interesting, as we've seen in the debates, how healthcare has really been the number one issue. In previous years and previous debates, healthcare was not a big issue. And as we saw, in the early debates, Senator Sanders, Senator Warren, Senator Kamala Harris, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, they all said, we're for Medicare for all, and this is going to be the be-all and the end-all for America. Well, as we saw, Kamala Harris has dropped out of the race. I think she kept flip-flopping on whether she supported single-payer or didn't, and I think she really got beaten up and couldn't raise money, and so she had to drop out. As we've seen, Senator Warren sort of backed off full Medicare for all to a stepping stone approach to Medicare for all. Senator Sanders, of course, is never going to back off his single-payer Medicare for all. But it's going to be very interesting. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, of course, has said, as she said in Rolling Stone magazine, Medicare for all, that's going to cost a lot. How are we going to pay for all of that? Although just recently she did come out and say, well, I guess we need to hear all sides. Maybe Medicare for all will be the ultimate goal. But I think the Democrats have a huge problem right now between the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the more moderate wing, the Joe Biden, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, their options. So I don't know where this is going to end up. But right now, since Harris dropped out, Warren is dropping. We've seen Senator Sanders, increasing his support in the polling for the Iowa caucuses, which are coming up. So I think if they do, choose someone like Senator Sanders, it's going to be just like in the UK, where Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn was completely wiped off the map in the recent British election, and Boris Johnson had a tremendous victory in that election. So I think the American people would definitely reject Senator Sanders and his very liberal, progressive ideas, but that'll be up to the Democrats to decide what line they want to take, more progressive or more moderate. So we'll see as this unfolds. But I think the Republicans have to come up with a plan showing, well, they don't support Medicare for all in the public option, what they do support, and that's part of my book, Solutions to How Do We Achieve Affordable, Accessible, Quality Care for All Americans.
Let's stay on that topic of the Republicans in healthcare and take a look at President Trump's healthcare agenda. Looking at it, he's proposed some solid reforms, but he's also come up with some pretty bad ideas too. So maybe you could give your thoughts on first the bad and end on a positive note with the good. And on balance, what grade would you give President Trump on healthcare?
President Trump is very kind of him. He does often quote me when he on his Twitter account and also on Facebook, which is very nice, on things that I write about, but he doesn't agree with everything that I support. On the bad side, on December the 18th, they introduced the proposed rule and the proposed guidance on importing drugs from Canada to relieve our expensive drug problem. And of course, I've written a lot on that. Canada cannot be the drugstore for the United States. If 20% of Americans got their drugs from Canada, within 6 months, Canada would have no drugs left for Canadians. So this is not going to work. President Trump and others in the U.S. do not talk about the fact that a lot of the drugs that are available here, where all of the research and development innovation goes on, they don't talk about the fact that in a country like Canada, Britain, France, all these countries have price controls. So they free ride off American innovation. But what is interesting is that many of the drugs that we have here, the biologics, the high-end drugs, are not even available in these countries. In Canada, the Patented Medicines Prices Review Board decides what drugs are going to come in. My own uncle passed away from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 2003. At the time, the new drug for NHL in this country was called Rituxan. It had been approved by the FDA in 1997, but even in Canada by 2003, it was still too expensive for the government to approve. The head of the cancer agency in Vancouver suggested to my cousin, who's a doctor, well, just take him down to Seattle, go to the Fred Hutchison Clinic and pay out of pocket. Well, as anyone knows, it's easier said than done, and when you're not well, to take a long trip. So a lot of the latest drugs aren't available. They're still too expensive. Under the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, there is a section in there which is very worrying. And Trump, of course, doesn't seem to understand that if you take away the 12-year data exclusivity for these high-end biologic drugs that are developed in America and allow Canada, Britain, other countries to deal the patent, it's going to result in far fewer new drugs being developed in this country and the latest drugs that are there. So that is a big problem within the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which of course doesn't have free trade in the title. Other things that are that I think are bad are in addition to drug importation, the international price index idea where Trump wants certain cancer drugs to be tied to an average of prices in 14 countries that have price controls. That this is also a disaster for America and for innovation. On the good side, he did a couple of executive orders, three or four executive orders that are very good. One, of course, is the short-term limited duration plans, which Obama had said they could only be available for a short period of time, which before Obamacare, they were available for a year. So the executive order under President Trump allows people to buy a short-term plan for up to 12 months, renewable for up to 3 years, and the plans that are offered in the short-term plans do not have to include Obamacare's very expensive 10 essential health benefits. So that is very good, particularly for younger people who don't want a plan that covers all of these mandates. They want a plan if they're self-employed, whatever. So STLDs are very good. The Association Health Plans, which was the executive order, which allows small businesses to group together and get a better rate on plans, allows small businesses and industries to group together. Very good idea. His health reimbursement accounts, those are very good ideas for giving people options to get health savings accounts. And then, of course, he had a good idea on price transparency, but I think that's not going anywhere. So those are all good ideas under the Trump administration, but I think there are some gaps in his knowledge. I guess I would give him, as of today, perhaps a C+. I don't believe in grade inflation.
Finally, Sally, you head up PRI's healthcare team, which includes Wayne Weingarten working on drug policy and Dr. Henry Miller focusing on medicine and science. What are some of the team's projects for 2020?
Well, in 2019, we set up the Center for Medical Economics and Innovation. Wayne Weingarten is heading that up, doing a lot of work, important work on the pricing of drugs, how drugs are priced, how drugs become available, and on ICER, which is like the British National Health Service's NICE program, which would really be if we got an ICER type plan, it would ration drugs and ration innovation in this country. So Wayne will be exposing a lot of the false promises. under an ICER type plan. So he's going to be doing a lot of that. There's a tremendous amount of work to be done, and education of the American people on drug pricing, drug availability, and of course moving to a price-controlled system. Dr. Henry Miller, who is an MD, founder of the FDA's Biotech Center several years ago, he does a lot of work on junk science, on vaccines, really pointing out why vaccines are so important for young people and keeping down childhood diseases in particular that were virtually eliminated, such as whooping cough, which now is on the rise because a number of parents think that vaccines cause autism, even though there is no scientific evidence that that is the case. So Henry will continue to do work on vaccines, on intellectual property issues, and my focus will continue to be on my healthcare book, False Premise, False Promise, The Disastrous Reality of Medicare for All, educating American people, pointing out the problems with Medicare for All, continuing my weekly column for foxnews.com on all of these important issues, educating Americans, my bi-weekly columns for Forbes.com and for the Washington Examiner's blog, Beltway Confidential. So a lot going on. As I say, this will be, I think, the most important issue for voters in the 2020 election, and we have to hope that we at PRI are able to do a good job educating Americans on why these programs and plans would be disastrous and why we need choice. Universal coverage can be achieved through universal choice. Americans have always loved choice in everything. We need choice in healthcare so people can get the kinds of plans and coverage that suits their needs and those of their families.
Thanks so much, Sally.
What about the wine?
Special thanks to Sally Pipes. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's a number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Please come back again for a next round with PRI.